I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my latest electricity bill. The number on the page made my stomach drop, a figure nearly triple my usual amount. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, or some kind of system glitch. But the charges were listed in excruciating detail, showing a spike in usage that had been steadily increasing for months. My heart pounded as I checked every appliance in my house, switched off unnecessary devices, and even monitored my power meter for any unusual surges. It made no sense. I lived alone, worked long hours, and barely used more than the basics. Yet, the numbers told a different story, one that I wasn't a part of. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was happening. Was someone stealing my electricity? The idea seemed absurd, but as I stood in my driveway staring at the power lines running between houses, I noticed something that hadn't caught my attention before. A faint hum filled the air, a low, almost imperceptible buzz that seemed to come from beyond my backyard fence, the one that separated my property from Karen's. I had never paid much attention to her greenhouse before, but now, standing there in the crisp evening air, I saw it in a new light. The soft glow of high-powered grow lights seeped through the glass panels, casting eerie green reflections on the grass. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed the unmistakable tangle of electrical cables snaking from the back of her greenhouse, leading directly to my power supply. For a moment, I just stood there, staring, trying to process what I was seeing. Was she really siphoning my electricity? Karen, my self-righteous, overbearing neighbor, who always bragged about her eco-friendly lifestyle, her self-sustaining greenhouse, and how she was so much more responsible than the rest of us? It was almost laughable. But there was nothing funny about what she was doing. The nerve. The absolute audacity of it. The realization sent a wave of anger through me, but I knew I needed proof. If I confronted her now, she'd deny everything, play the victim, and somehow twist the situation in her favor. No, if I was going to take her down, I had to be smart about it. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, watching her greenhouse at different hours. The more I observed, the clearer the truth became. The amount of electricity she was using wasn't just excessive, it was outrageous. Industrial-grade grow lights, heating elements, automatic watering systems, it was a full-scale operation. And the best part? She wasn't paying for a single watt of it. Each night, I watched as the greenhouse hummed to life, bathed in an unnatural glow while my electric meter spun like a roulette wheel on overdrive. She was stealing from me, plain and simple, and it was time to put an end to it. But I wouldn't just shut it down. No, I was going to expose her for the fraud she was. Now, I just needed the perfect moment to strike. The first step was to gather undeniable proof, something so irrefutable that even Karen wouldn't be able to weasel her way out of it. I set up a small security camera facing the section of my backyard where her makeshift power heist was connected. Every night, I watched from my laptop as the footage streamed in real time, the greenhouse flaring up like a Christmas tree, its energy-hungry equipment leaching from my supply without a second thought. It was surreal. Here was a woman who preached about environmental consciousness, who loved to scold neighbors about excessive waste, yet she had no problem stealing hundreds of dollars worth of electricity from me. The hypocrisy was almost as infuriating as the theft itself. But I couldn't just rely on footage. If this was going to be a full takedown, I needed to hit her where it hurt, the authorities, the community, and most of all, her reputation. I took note of every spike in my electricity usage, compared it against the recorded footage, and compiled a folder filled with undeniable proof. I even took thermal images of the greenhouse from my bedroom window at night, showing just how much heat and power her illegal setup was producing. The final straw came when I checked my meter at dawn, and the numbers had surged by an amount that was physically impossible for my own household's usage. That morning, I decided to confront her, not directly, but strategically. I walked past her yard with my phone in hand, pretending to be on a call but making sure my voice was loud enough for her to hear. Yeah, the utility company is really interested in the footage, I said, pacing along the fence. They said it looks like straight-up power theft and might have to involve the police. I heard the clatter of a watering can hitting the pavement from the other side. Karen had been tending to her plants, and now she was frozen in place, her eyes darting toward me, trying to act casual. "Everything all right, Karen?" I asked, forcing a polite smile. She hesitated before nodding. "Oh, yes, just, busy morning. You know how it is." Her voice was a little too high-pitched, a little too forced. She was rattled. Good. I let the tension stew for the rest of the day, waiting to see if she'd make a move. That night, I stayed up late watching my security feed. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., Karen crept out of her house, a flashlight in hand, and made her way toward the greenhouse. I leaned closer to my screen, watching as she kneeled down behind it, fumbling with the stolen wiring, her hands shaking as she tried to disconnect it. She knew she was caught. She was trying to erase the evidence. But it was too late. I already had everything I needed. The next morning, I made my move. I sent a formal complaint to the utility company, attaching the videos, the meter readings, and even the thermal scans of her greenhouse operating in the dead of night. Within hours, I got a response. They were escalating the case and sending an investigator. Things were moving fast now, and Karen had no idea just how deep in trouble she was about to be. I made sure to be outside when the investigator arrived, a clipboard in hand as he took readings from my meter and traced the stolen power lines leading straight to Karen's property. "This is clear-cut theft," he muttered, shaking his head as he snapped photos. Karen must have seen him from her window because, within minutes, she stormed outside, her face twisted in forced confusion. "What's going on here?" she demanded, folding her arms. The investigator barely looked up. "Ma'am, we have evidence that your greenhouse has been illegally siphoning power from your neighbor's property. We're conducting an official investigation." Karen laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. "That's ridiculous. Why would I do something like that? I have solar panels, my greenhouse is completely self-sufficient." The investigator didn't even flinch. "Then you won't mind if we cut the external power source and check if your greenhouse still runs?" he said, gesturing to the exposed cables. Karen paled, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to come up with an excuse. She had nowhere to run. I crossed my arms and watched as the reality of her situation set in. She was cornered, and this was only the beginning. Karen's face twisted as she realized the walls were closing in. She stammered, trying to come up with a response, but the investigator was already moving. He bent down, yanked the illegal wiring free, and followed it straight to my electrical panel, where the evidence was as clear as day. "This was deliberately connected to your neighbor's power," he said, pulling out a phone to take more photos. Karen's forced confidence cracked like shattered glass. Her hands clenched at her sides, and her breathing grew sharp and erratic. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, scrambling for an escape route, a plausible excuse, something, anything, to save face. But there was nothing she could say that would make this go away. This is a misunderstanding," she finally croaked, forcing a brittle laugh. "Maybe the wiring got mixed up somehow. I wouldn't steal electricity. That's absurd." But the investigator wasn't having it. "Ma'am, your greenhouse is consuming far more power than a setup of this size should need. And unless you're running a commercial-grade operation in there, I'm inclined to believe it's been deliberately connected to an outside power source. If that source isn't your own electrical panel, then it's a violation of theft laws. This isn't just a mix-up, it's a criminal offense." Karen's face lost all color. Criminal offense. The words hung in the air like an executioner's axe, and for the first time, she seemed to grasp just how much trouble she was really in. I watched, arms crossed, as her eyes darted from the investigator to me. There was something raw and ugly in her expression, anger, panic, desperation. She knew I had been watching her, knew I had set this all up, and now she had nowhere to run. Her mouth curled into a sneer. "You did this on purpose," she spat at me, as if she were the victim here. "You've always had it out for me. This is harassment." I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer audacity of it. "Karen, you've been stealing from me for months. I have the footage. I have the data. And now, they have the proof." I gestured toward the investigator, who was already on his phone, making a report. "You did this to yourself." Karen's fury flared bright and hot. "You're overreacting. It's not like I hurt anyone. What's a little extra electricity? You make enough money, don't you? You didn't even notice until now." Her voice had taken on a shrill, defensive edge, but it didn't matter. The evidence spoke louder than she ever could. "That's not how theft works," the investigator said dryly, still tapping away on his device. "Doesn't matter how much someone makes, you don't have the right to take what isn't yours. I'm filing an official report, and the utility company will pursue damages." Karen's mask of composure shattered completely. Her eyes were wide now, glistening with the realization that this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. "Wait, no, this doesn't need to be official," she rushed out, stepping forward with a nervous chuckle. "Come on, I'm sure we can settle this without all that. I'll pay him back, whatever he thinks I owe. No need to get law enforcement involved, right?" But the investigator didn't even look up from his phone. "Too late for that, ma'am. Your account will be flagged, and the authorities may follow up if they choose to pursue charges." That was it. That was the moment she broke. Her entire posture sagged, her shoulders slumping forward as if the weight of her own arrogance had finally come crashing down. She turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was no smugness left in her expression, only fear. "Please," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "I can fix this. Just, don't let them take it further. You don't understand what this could do to me." And there it was. The same woman who had spent years looking down on the neighborhood, who had lectured people about energy conservation and doing the right thing, was now begging to be let off the hook for stealing what wasn't hers. Part of me almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then I remembered the months of overinflated bills, the condescending attitude, the way she had tried to turn the situation around on me the second she was caught. No, she didn't get to play the victim now. "That's not my problem, Karen," I said, meeting her gaze with calm, unwavering certainty. "You made your choice. Now you live with it." She inhaled sharply, her face twisting into something between a grimace and a snarl. But before she could say another word, the investigator spoke again. "Ma'am, I need you to be aware that tampering with electrical infrastructure is a serious offense. You're lucky we caught this before it escalated further." He pointed toward the now dead greenhouse, its once bright lights now dark and lifeless. "If something had gone wrong, an electrical surge, a fire, you wouldn't just be facing fines. You'd be facing a felony." Karen's eyes flickered toward her greenhouse as if she were only now realizing how deep of a hole she had dug for herself. Her breath hitched, and for a split second, I saw something that looked an awful lot like realization and regret. But it didn't matter anymore. This was out of my hands now. I turned, walking back toward my house, feeling a weight lift off my chest with each step. For the first time in months, I wouldn't have to obsessively check my electricity meter, wouldn't have to feel that constant frustration every time I paid an overinflated bill. Karen's game was over, and this time, she had no one to blame but herself. But something told me this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. For the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and side glances. Word had spread fast: Karen, the self-proclaimed environmentalist, had been exposed as a power thief. People who had once admired her dedication to sustainability were now muttering behind her back, shaking their heads at the sheer hypocrisy of it all. I caught snippets of conversations whenever I stepped outside, neighbors exchanging hushed words about the investigator's visit, the cables running from her greenhouse, and the way she had tried to talk her way out of trouble. Even the ones who had been on good terms with her were now keeping their distance. Karen, on the other hand, had gone eerily quiet. No more daily lectures about composting, no more unsolicited advice about how everyone should do their part for the planet. It was almost unsettling how quickly she had retreated into her home, as if hiding from the very people she had once tried to control. But I knew better than to think she had given up. People like Karen didn't just accept defeat, they plotted their next move. And sure enough, I didn't have to wait long before she tried to weasel her way out of the mess she had created. It started with an envelope left at my doorstep. At first, I thought it was another notice from the utility company, maybe a follow-up about the investigation, but the moment I picked it up, I recognized Karen's tight, almost aggressively neat handwriting on the front. I sighed, already knowing this wasn't going to be an apology. Inside, I found a short letter, written in the same clipped, condescending tone she had always used when pretending to be civil. I hope you understand that this situation has been blown out of proportion. I never intended to cause harm, and I believe we can come to a mutual agreement that doesn't involve further unnecessary action. I propose a financial settlement for any inconvenience you've faced. Let's handle this like reasonable adults. I almost laughed out loud. A financial settlement? After months of theft, after the investigator had already flagged her account, she thought she could just pay me off and pretend none of it had happened? The sheer arrogance of it was almost impressive. She wasn't sorry, she was desperate. She knew that if the utility company pursued this further, she could be facing serious consequences, possibly even legal action. And now, rather than admit fault, she was trying to buy her way out. I took the letter inside, folded it neatly, and dropped it straight into the trash. If she thought I was going to let her off the hook that easily, she was dead wrong. The next day, I noticed Karen pacing in her front yard, clearly waiting for me to come outside. When I finally stepped out to grab my mail, she pounced. "Did you get my letter?" she asked, her voice saccharine sweet, but her eyes sharp with calculation. "I did," I said flatly, not bothering to stop walking. "And," she pressed, trailing a few steps behind me. "I think it's a fair offer. I don't see why we need to drag this out any further. It's just electricity." That set me off. I turned to face her, my patience hanging by a thread. "It's not just electricity, Karen. It's months of theft. It's lying, manipulating, and draining my resources without a second thought. And now that you're caught, you want to throw some money at it and make it go away. That's not how this works." Karen's fake pleasant expression cracked, just for a second, before she forced a tight smile. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "No, you made it complicated when you decided to steal from me," I shot back. "The utility company is handling it now. It's out of my hands." That was the breaking point. The polite facade crumbled in an instant, and Karen's true nature came roaring to the surface. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" she snapped, stepping closer. "So eager to see me suffer over some stupid wires? I was just trying to keep my greenhouse running. It's people like you who don't care about sustainability, who would rather watch someone struggle than show a little generosity." I cut her off with a dry laugh. "Karen, you weren't struggling. You were stealing. And now that you're facing the consequences, you're trying to turn this into some moral debate? Give me a break." Her nostrils flared, her hands balled into fists at her sides, but she had nothing left to say. The truth was too obvious, and she knew it. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stomped back toward her house, slamming the door behind her so hard that a few birds scattered from the trees. I exhaled, shaking my head. This wasn't over. Not yet. People like Karen didn't just back down, they plotted, they schemed, they found new ways to dig themselves deeper into trouble. And something told me she wasn't done making this my problem. For the next week, Karen kept to herself, but I could feel the storm brewing. The air around her house felt charged with something unspoken, a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't the type to go down quietly, and sure enough, it didn't take long before she made her next move. One morning, just as I was stepping outside with my coffee, I noticed a bright red notice taped to my front door. My stomach twisted as I yanked it off and scanned the bold letters at the top. A formal complaint had been filed against me, with the Homeowners Association. I almost laughed. Karen had gone nuclear. I wasn't even surprised anymore. When backed into a corner, people like her didn't apologize or make amends, they doubled down, desperate to twist reality until they were the victim. And now, she was trying to weaponize the HOA against me. According to the complaint, I had been engaging in aggressive and hostile behavior toward a fellow resident, creating an unsafe and confrontational environment in the neighborhood. The hypocrisy was staggering. She had been the one stealing from me, the one who got caught, and now she was painting herself as some poor, innocent victim. But there was one problem: her reputation was already in shambles. The HOA, which Karen had once lorded over with her holier-than-thou attitude, was already wary of her after news of the electricity theft had spread. People whispered about it at the mailbox, in the grocery store, even at the local coffee shop. The same people she had spent years scolding about minor infractions, an untrimmed lawn, a trash bin left out too long, had no sympathy for her now. Still, she was grasping at straws, hoping that if she threw enough accusations at me, something would stick. I didn't even have to fight this battle myself. By the time I showed up to the next HOA meeting, Karen was already on the defensive. The moment I walked in, all eyes turned to me. Karen was at the center of the room, standing stiffly with a stack of papers in her hands, her mouth pressed into a thin, self-satisfied smirk, until she saw me. Her expression faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice laced with artificial sweetness. "I think it's important that we clear up the concerns I've raised." I didn't bother responding. Instead, I took a seat and let her talk. She launched into a dramatic monologue, painting herself as a harassed and intimidated homeowner, claiming that my actions had made her feel unsafe in her own home. She sighed deeply, shaking her head as if she were genuinely exhausted by it all. "I've always been an advocate for this community," she continued, addressing the HOA board. "And I've always followed the rules. But lately, I feel like I'm being unfairly targeted." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the board members exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed. No one interrupted her, but there was no nodding in agreement, no murmurs of support. Karen might have once had sway here, but she had burned too many bridges. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the HOA president sighed and leaned forward. "Karen," he said slowly, rubbing his temple, "we've already been contacted by the utility company about your situation." Karen stiffened. "That has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You stole electricity from your neighbor. That is theft, Karen. And now you're standing here, trying to accuse him of harassment?" He shook his head. "This isn't a legal matter for the HOA, and frankly, I don't appreciate you wasting our time with baseless complaints." Karen's face went beet red. But the HOA president wasn't done. "Furthermore, we've had multiple neighbors come forward about your behavior before this incident. You've made a lot of people uncomfortable, Karen. And frankly, after everything that's come to light, I think it's time we have a discussion about your place in this association." The room shifted. I could feel it, the slow, creeping realization on Karen's face that she had lost control of the narrative. I sat back, watching as the tables turned completely. She had called this meeting to paint herself as the victim, but now she was the one on trial. Neighbors who had stayed silent before finally spoke up, about her condescending attitude, her unnecessary complaints, the way she had tried to bully others into following her ridiculous, self-imposed rules. It was like a dam had broken, and everything Karen had worked so hard to hide behind a mask of self-righteousness was laid bare for everyone to see. By the time the meeting ended, Karen's position on the HOA board was officially revoked. She didn't even look at me as she left. She stormed out without a word, her hands clenched into tight fists, her entire body radiating defeat and humiliation. That night, I stood in my backyard, staring at her now dark and silent greenhouse. The tangled mess of cables was gone, the power drained from the stolen connection. Justice had been served, and for the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. But Karen wasn't the type to disappear quietly. And somehow, I knew, this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. The war might have been won, but the battle? That was still to come.